Hello, humans. Um, this is a video, part one of three parts about women in Chinese medicine and the way I've only seen male doctors write about this, the way doctors looked at unmarried women or women that somehow didn't have a male partner. And so, quoting from some of the things I'm going to talk about. This is not my words, this is the words of the old books. Desiring a man she cannot have, part one. So, why is it not letting me? There. Okay. Um, yeah. So, there's a book that came out. I've been researching this for like a long time. And, after I'd already been researching this for a long time, a book came out which covers this topic also quite a bit. So, in case you're interested, Divine, Demonic, and Disordered is a book about women without men in the Song Dynasty. Of course, I'm going to go over some other time periods besides that by Xiaowen Cheng. And it's a very interesting book. Some of it's medical, some of it's about other things besides medical. Um, but I'm going to go over the medical part. And so there's this long thread that exists throughout the history of China, although it's, not broad. There's not a lot of writing about it, but if you search carefully throughout the history of Chinese medicine, you do find these cases or these discussions on manless women. That's the phrase that Xiaowen Cheng uses in her book. So I've adopted that phrase. Um, and so for at least 2000 years, they've been talking about it, probably longer. And so who are the people that were at risk? Nuns, widows, palace maidens, because if you worked for the imperial palace and you're a woman, you probably weren't allowed to marry. You had to live in the palace and you couldn't marry. That's not talking about concubines and stuff like that and empresses, but even just the people who waited on you and so forth. Temple maidens, and eventually we're going to see also like teenage girls before they got married. Some of them were susceptible to this. So if they were of reproductive age and if they didn't have a man, certain medical conditions could arise according to these male doctors. So the first instance of this is in Shiji, the historical records by Sima Qian. The information's down here. Volume 105 has the biography of Bian Chui, but it also has the biography of someone named Chun Yu Yi, who was a doctor who got a malpractice suit against him, and to defend himself in court, he gave a bunch of his case studies. So there's this lady Han who's not allowed to marry while she's working for the king, and she got sick. So here's the story. This is from historical records. Lady Han was an attendant to the king of some place called Jibei. This was before the Han Dynasty. She became ill with back pain and fever and chills. This Han Re is like literally cold and heat. It's often translated as fever and chills, but I think it's more reasonable to think that sensations of cold and heat, which may not be an actual fever, may not be shivering chills. Anyway, she had seen a whole bunch of doctors, and all of them said, it's just fever and chills, like external attack, whatever. But remember, this is the Dr. Chun Yu Yi talking to the judge. He says, your subject, he's being very polite, your subject, Chun Yu Yi, I examined her pulse and said, oh, it's internal cold, and her monthly activity does not descend. So internal cold, not external invasion. And her monthly activity does not descend means amenorrhea. So then I fumed her with herbs. So he burnt herbs and she sat in the smoke. Or sometimes this is used for steaming, but it's actually not the word for steaming, it's the word for fuming, like burning stuff. Anyway, her monthly activity descended, and before long her illness ceased. So she no longer had amenorrhea, she no longer had fever and chills. She did it say she had back pain? Yeah, back pain. And so then he goes on to explain this case. She had become ill from desiring a man she could not have. That's what I called this, you know, this video. So how did he know? Did she actually say, "Oh, I really want someone," or is this his speculation? I think because of the separation between the sexes, she probably wasn't talking about being lonely and wishing she had someone. It's not clear, by the way, if did she want a specific person or did she just wish she had a relationship, which is a common thing. So maybe she had a crush on somebody, or maybe she just was lonely and wished she had someone. It's not clear. Anyway, so he explains, how did I know that the type of illness she suffered was I examined her pulse. When I pressed it, I found out that the kidney pulse was rough and did not correspond. That's a thing you see in old books, and you don't generally see it in modern times. What I believe it means is that the pulse was unexpected. Okay, so a rough pulse with amenorrhea makes sense because blood is not flowing, so the pulse is, rough. And that goes, or choppy. Some of you say choppy. Anyway, so he says rough and not corresponding means its coming was difficult and firm. And so I said her monthly activity did not descend. And so he's not saying this from interviewing her. He's like feeling her pulse and then saying, "Oh, you've got amenorrhea." The liver pulse was wiry and it went beyond the left tsunko. So I said she desires a man she cannot have. So the wiry liver pulse, and in other books later, we'll find that doctors thought that it went up towards lung 10, Yuji. It went up towards the thumb beyond the normal position, going beyond the Tsunko higher up. And so that is going to be the pulse that's associated with desiring a man she cannot have. As I said, it's unclear, does she have a crush on someone or she just wants a relationship? And it also seems that he decided this from the pulse and from his own imagination, and that she didn't tell him these things. And so, was he really understanding what her situation was, or was he thinking, this is a palace maiden, and so she can't have any relationships, and she's kind of cute and she looks a little lonely, so she probably is wanting someone. Maybe she'll want me. Who knows what he's thinking. And I know this will outrage some people who hear it, but yeah, that's like he's just making up stuff, probably. And so maybe she was indeed dissatisfied, but it might not because she wanted a man. It might be because she missed her family, her parents. It might be because she's not well treated there. But we don't even know if she was dissatisfied at all. So, this is the start of this thread of manless women in Chinese medicine. This is the first writing we have that talks about it. And yeah, so we don't really know what was going on in Lady Han's mind or heart, but this is how it all started. The next time we come across this idea. It's a little bit different. It's not necessarily from exactly the same tradition, but there's this really interesting book called The Lost Book of Master Chu, who was, this is the period of disunity when nobody could like keep become emperor of all of China for very long. And so sometimes there were different states in different places. And, if somebody was able to unite China, it only lasted like 15 minutes. So this is one of those small, dynasties during this period of disunity. And this person, Master Chu, was, if I remember correctly, the son-in-law of the king. And he was also an advisor to the king. And so there's this book of his advice to the king, and some of it had nothing to do with medicine, but some of it was about aging and some of it was about sex. And so he's talking to the king and he says, once female Tiangui has arrived. So Tiangui, if you remember or if you ever knew, in Suen chapter 1, it talks about 7-year periods of development for females. So when she's 7, she gets her adult teeth and her adult hair. When she's 14, Tiangui arrives. And while a lot of people say this means menstrual blood or menstruation arrives, but when 16 males, Tiangui arrives. So it's something that precedes menstruation, but it does mean fertility has arrived. So this once female Tiangui has arrived means when she's 14, if she goes for 10 years without joining with a male, she develops irregularity, which has to mean irregular menstruation. Let's look at the next, a couple sentences from here. If less than 10 years have passed, but she longs to join with a male, she'll also develop irregularity. So when she's irregular, the old blood doesn't exit the body. So yeah, that sounds like, a menstrual issue. And new blood moves improperly because the old blood didn't get out of the way. So this blood soaks into the bones or mutates into masses. And once that's begun, even if she joins with a male, it's kind of late and it's difficult for her to become pregnant. So I have longs in red, and before I had desires in red. I'm going to talk about those two terms briefly, but let's finish this passage. He also says, though, be careful about too much sex. He says, frequent joining with a male dries out and withers people, making them deficient. Giving birth and breastfeeding a lot withers blood and kills people. So if you observe Jing and blood, you've already understood more than half of what you need to know in order to understand the situation. So again, this, when it says that she longs to join with a male, it doesn't specify if she has a crush on a particular person or she just is ready, feels she's ready for marriage, but she's not yet married. And so, if we take the timeline from this book, so at 14, Tiangui arrives, she becomes fertile. And it says if she goes for 10 years without joining with a male, she's going to become irregular menstruation. If she longs to join with a male between 14 and 24, then she's also going to develop irregularity. But if she doesn't think about men or sex or anything like that, then she can go the full 10 years and be okay. But elsewhere in the book, it says that girls should marry at 20 and males should marry at 30. Okay, so he says, because in that way, yin can become full. So from another passage, it says, even if a female is 14 and her Tiangui has arrived, she should be 20 to marry, because the king was really into marrying younger or having sex with young girls. And this guy, Chu Cheng, is saying, no, they're too young. the king is worrying, why doesn't he have a male heir? And Chu Chung is saying, you got to let them get a little older first. So 20 is actually old, though, for women to marry in ancient China. They often married around 16 or something like that. So anyway, this is Chu Chung's timeline, but this is the only discussion I know that talks about, or this is the earliest discussion that really talks about female desire. Well, Lady Han also did, but I kind of feel a little bit more like with Lady Han that she wanted a relationship. I could be wrong. And with in this case, I feel it's more about sex. And it's actually in large part, I think, about getting pregnant because, they didn't have really reliable birth control. And so if you have sex, you're going to get pregnant. And they had such strong desire to have lots of kids and especially to have male heirs. And so it's actually not even clear. Maybe these women are longing for a baby. Or maybe they're just longing to be married because that makes them an adult. Or maybe they actually do have sexual desire. In some cases, it seems more about sex. In some of these, writings, because remember, this is only part one of three. In some of the writings, it seems to be more about having babies. And in some of the writings, it seems to just, be that she's longing and dissatisfied. Anyway, so in Lady Han's case, in Shiji, she desired a man, but in Chu Cheng's, writing, she longs for a man. And the thing, like, yeah, so this word "se," which here I'm translating as longs for, is the same word that is thinking in the five emotions. Okay. But actually, you look it up in a dictionary, and this word can also mean to long for, to yearn for, to pine for something. And so, that really changed my understanding of when we say the spleen is in charge of, like thought is, corresponds to the spleen. And, we also long for food. We yearn for food. We pine for, ooh, I want a piece of cake or something like that. So it doesn't only mean to like literally think, although it can mean that for sure, but it can also mean like a strong yearning, which I think is more appropriate here. She's not just thinking about, gee, I wonder what it'd be like to be with a man. She's longing, it seems. And the word here that I translated as desire can mean sexual desire, sensual desire, and it often does, but it can just mean, I want this, I want that, I want something. It doesn't have to be about sex, but it certainly can be applied to sex. So, okay, I'm moving on to the third thing here in this part one, the early references. So in the Southern Song Dynasty, you can see the dates. There was a doctor named Xu Shūwei, and I've done some case studies from him. He's kind of an interesting guy. He's often called Scholar Xu because he was studious. And he was really a Jingfang practitioner, which means he only loved Shanghan Lun and Jingui Yaowei, but he still did adapt some stuff. And anyway, one of his books is called 90 Cases of Cold Damage of Shanghan and his discussion on it. It's an interesting book historically. It was the first book solely dedicated to medical case histories, but it was only hand copied and passed around for a long time, and it wasn't actually published until much later. So he has his case 80 out of 90 cases, and is talking about a Buddhist nun. So obviously, she's not supposed to have a guy. She became ill with aversion to wind, tired body, alternating chills and fever. Remember, Lady Han had chills and fever, or cold and heat, but now it's specifying alternating. There it didn't specify, simultaneous or alternating. Here it's alternating. Red face, heart vexation. So, irritable, fidgety, and occasional sweating. Another doctor treated it as malaria due to Shanghan, due to cold damage. And that doctor saw her with alternating fever and chills and said, "Oh, it's malaria and there's an epidemic right now." So he gave her a mixture of Da Chai Hu Tang and Shao Chai Hu Tang. But after several days, it just got worse. So now Xu Shūwei, I examined her and I said, the pulse, both pulses, does not reflect external evils. This isn't a Shanghan situation. This is a Jue Yin thing, since the pulse is wiry, but not a Shanghan Lun Jue Yin thing. Jue Yin is liver channel. The pulse is wiry and long. It runs up to lung 10 to, the base of the thumb to Yuji. How does it do that? I don't know. I've never felt a pulse like that, but maybe I've never had a woman who is longing for a man as my patient. I don't know. Anyway, so this became the thing. And, in the future episodes, like this has 3 parts. In the future parts, we're going to see from here on, everybody talks about the pulse being wiry and long going up to lung 10. That became the way that she was longing for a man. Okay, so he said, this is not cold damage. This is yin stirring, but it can't get yang. Yin and yang need each other and want each other. So her yin is like activated, but there's no yang for it to partner up with. And he says, this is exactly the same as when Sang Gong, who is another name of Chen Yui, the first case with Lady Han. This is, exactly the same as Lady Han's case. So I gave this nun herbs to repress yin. Note that phrase, repress yin. We'll talk about it and so forth. And she recovered after several days. He goes on, after he presents a case, then he always has a discussion, and he starts saying, the discussion says, in the past, Chu Cheng said nuns and widows should be treated using different formulas from married women. Okay, so actually, he never said that. Like, we looked at Chu Cheng, although we didn't look at the whole book, but I've searched through the whole book. He never said nuns and widows should be treated using different formulas. But that text was hand copied for a long time. So that could be in one version of the text that Xu Shūwei had. But we saw, he said the girls shouldn't marry until they're 20, and that, they should get married within 10 years of their Tiangui arriving, that one. So Chu Cheng said nuns and widows should be treated using different formulas. And this becomes a statement that's repeated in later case studies and so forth. So that's what we have to do here. He said nuns and widows live a solitary existence, discontent with its bleakness. This is solitary yin without yang. So this, Xu Shūwei can't imagine a woman being content as a nun or as a widow being able to live an independent life. He can't imagine a woman who may not feel a strong need to have a man in her life. He certainly doesn't seem to be able to understand. Some of them might be what we today call lesbian. Or just satisfied without a person. Yeah. So anyway, that's the beginning of his talk. He continues and says, desires of the heart repeatedly sprout, but desires are inappropriate. Nuns aren't supposed to have those kind of desires, and widows are supposed to stay chaste. They're supposed to stay faithful to their dead husband. So it's inappropriate for them to have desire because they don't have a legitimate spouse. And he has another book that's called Puji Bunchafang, and it has kind of an expanded line here in the other book when he's telling the same story. He says, these two types of non-wives, nuns and widows, are solitary yin without yang. Desires of the heart stir, but they're unfulfilled. Unfulfilled. Oh. So because of, there's solitary yin without yang, yin and yang interact contentiously. They're not harmonious. And that's why they're alternating chills and fever, deficiency, sweating, like sweating due to deficiency, like yin deficiency causes sweating, even though he's saying there's solitary yin. And fatigue. All of this is in the category of warm malaria. So now he's saying this is a type of malaria, but back then they didn't think of malaria as having to do with mosquitoes or something that the mosquito, some pathogen that the mosquito carries. They thought of malaria as certain types of diseases with alternating fever and chills. So anyway, after a long time of this, the person gets worn down and it becomes consumption, which is another word for tuberculosis, kind of. But also this same word has the disease radical, but if you take away the disease radical, it's just like taxation, exhaustion kind of stuff. So if you don't have a man, you're going to get malaria and get exhausted. Okay. So then Xu Shūwei told the story from historical records of Lady Han. He told it in his own words, and he really emphasized the long pulse. And then he continues, males are governed by jing, females are governed by blood. When a male's jing overflows, he longs for the bedroom. Remember, jing can mean semen. So this is like when he's, when he feels sexual desire, when he has a hard-on, when he wants to ejaculate, he longs for the bedroom. But when a female's blood flourishes, she wants to get pregnant. So here to him, it's not even sexual desire, it's that she wants to get pregnant. The liver absorbs blood, the liver stores blood, whatever. Here, the liver pulse was wiry and long, with the upper Tsunko reaching lung 10. And he said that indicates that her blood was, kind of overflowing because it wasn't being used for pregnancy. This is a symptom of desiring a man. So that being so, we really can't talk about nuns and widows and treating them the same way we can talk about ordinary married women, because how could an ordinary married woman desire a man? She already has one. Sorry, I find this a little amusing. So he has a formula which he calls Dihuangwan, which kind of gets confusing because it could be confused for Lu Wei Di Huang Wang, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is, not 6, it's 5, and it's not the same 5. So, but it does start with Di Huang. Cool the blood with Sheng Di Huang, and Chai Hu to help harmonize the liver. We've got Qinzhou, and we've got Huang Qin, cool, and Chirshao to cool the blood. And so that's his formula. Powder the above, make it into pills with honey pills. And each dose is 30. These are tiny pills, 30 swallowed with a decoction of the, processed plum or whatever it is. 3 doses per day taken, throughout the day at any time, before meals, after meals, doesn't matter. And so that's his formula for this condition. So, we can treat women's desire using this formula because it's got so many cooling herbs that'll cool down her desire. Okay, so that's what he had to say. There's a Ming Dynasty doctor, Gong Ting Xian, who actually used exactly the same formula, but he called it Duan Yuan, which is pill to break off desire, right? To break off women's sexual desire. And he also called it yin repressing pill. And remember that Xu Shūwei said that he was going to give a formula to repress yin. So does this formula repress yin? I don't know. So it's the same formula and it's pretty much made the same way. So we don't need to talk about it again. Okay. And so you can see then that this idea of the long pulse going up to lung 10 and the alternating fever and chills, and that the woman doesn't have a man, make her susceptible to, in the eyes of these male doctors. There's one more text I want to talk about. This is the last text for this part one. So there's this Fu Ren Da Chuan Liang Fang, like Great Completion of Good Formulas for Women by Chén Zìmíng, another Southern Song Dynasty doctor. So, not too different from Xu Shūwei, a little bit later. And he calls this section Discussion of Formulas for Solitary Women with Malaria-like Sensations of Fever and Chills or of cold and heat. And he says ailments of solitary women were not spoken of in ancient times. The only ones who talked about them was the biography of Cang Gong or Chun Yu, the Lady Han story, and then Chu Cheng. Those are the only ones who talked about it, and I gave you those texts. And he goes on to describe this word Gua, which is often translated as widow, but it has a meaning beyond widow, but that's what it means. It usually means a widow, but it also has other meanings: lacking, deficient, alone, solitary. And so it was used for, somebody who, for whatever reason, just never married. It doesn't have to be a widow, but that was the most common use of it. So he says this word gua, widow or whatever, he's quoting from Meng, this, philosopher pre-Han, said someone without a husband is called a widow, a gua, but doesn't say because the husband died. It's just someone without a husband. Okay, so a manless woman. And so, for example, a nun or a woman whose husband has died is a solitary yin without yang. And she's going to desire a man, but can't have one. So she gets run down and disease develops. It's dangerous not to have some guy in your life. I hope you know I'm being a little bit sarcastic. Anyway, I Ching says, when heaven and earth are harmonious and prosperous, the 10,000 things transform and mellow. When men and women wed their Jing together, the 10,000 things transform and are born. How can lonely yang or solitary yin do this? So actually, by mentioning lonely yang, that sounds like a man living by himself also, is going to be out of balance. And so a man has already been through the door of her apartment. So desires of the heart sprout but are unsatisfied. So this is a little bit funny. A man, a husband, has already been through into the women's chambers, into her women's chambers. That's almost a sexual image, right? He's gone through the door, he's gone through the gate. So once she's had sex, she's never going to be satisfied. And if she can't have sex anymore, right? So once a man has been through the door of her apartment, then she's going to be unsatisfied if she can't have another man. So until yin and, so after she's unsatisfied because she doesn't have a man anymore, then yin and yang will interact contentiously with alternating fever and chills, similar to malarial disease. If this goes on for a long time, it becomes taxation. He's saying pretty similar thing to the previous Xu Shūwei. So there's symptoms such as menstrual block, amenorrhea, which is what Lady Han had, white oozing. That's such an ugly word. This word, it's not the same word as for abnormal vaginal discharge, but I think that's kind of what they mean. This word itself has a lot of meanings: unrestrained, illegitimate, obscene, lewd, and lust. But it also has a meaning to soak or saturate. So it's some kind of discharge due to her lust, right? It's like a really a word that implies dirtiness. Phlegm, counterflow, headwind, recurrent headaches, diaphragm chi, so like difficulty swallowing or hiccups or stuff like that. Glomus, so some kind of feeling of something stuck in her, an oppression. Her face will thin. All of these are diseases of solitary women. In pulse examination, the liver pulse alone is wiry. Just the liver pulse is wiry, and it goes beyond the Zunko up to lung 10. And so, all her diseases are due from blood flourishing. You would think blood flourishing would be healthy, but no, that's a sign that her body wants to be pregnant, but she doesn't have anyone to get pregnant with. So now her body's unhappy as well as her heart. So this is the last slide. The classic says, when a male's jing flourishes, he longs for the bedroom. When a female's blood flourishes, she wants to get pregnant. We saw that quote before. Observing her menstrual blood is already more than half of what you need to know to diagnose her. And then this book, Liang Fang, as it's frequently called, gives basically the same formula as Xu Shūwei's Di Huang Wan, but he calls it Sheng Di Huang Wan. And so that's the first part. These are the old sources. I think after this, we'll move into the Ming and Qing dynasty, and we'll see maybe some Yuan dynasty too. Yeah, there's Judanxi. So we'll see what the standard doctors say. And then in the third one, there's some creepy stuff that I saved for the third part. Some creepy stuff that can happen when the woman has too much desire. So, I'm making fun of this, and I think there is some stuff that's laughable, but there definitely are women and men who long for a relationship and they can't find anyone, or they had a breakup and they're never able to let go and find someone again, or they don't have a relationship, but they're just longing for a baby and they're worried about their biological clock running out. And so, I think some of these male doctors' conclusions are a bit off, but I wonder if there are some ways to treat these unfulfilled desires. Men and women have unfulfilled desires. And of course, herbs aren't going to really fill them the same way a meaningful relationship might. But I wonder if these herbs could help with some of it. But I also have some skepticism about this male perspective on female desire. Anyway, that's it for part one. I'll have, parts 2 and 3 shortly.